so the idea here is patterns and the addiction to those patterns is really this idea that that's just the way life is. That's just the way my relationship is with that person.
This is Becoming, the podcast for leaders to think differently with actionable tips in 30 minutes or less to claim your intuition, your influence, and your agency. And finally get to the truth of what stands between you and who you are meant to become. Many of us believe that once we become that future self, then we will be happy, successful, and complete. This podcast exists to shine a light on the truth that the time is now and your future self can be who you become today. Let's dive in.
Welcome back to another episode of Becoming. I am your host, Stacy Baron-Fuss. I'm very excited to dive into today's addiction as we dive into these different addictions so that you can embrace and lean into your awakening and the process of awakening. Remember that as we dive into each of these addictions, each one of them are intertwined with each other. And so as you uncover one, you're going to unwind others. You may really resonate with one of the addictions that I talk about and find that another addiction just does not resonate at all. Know that by you bringing attention to the one that is at the forefront of your experience, that is going to start unwinding the others. They're all in connection. They're all in this web of webs within us. And once you can start to see each one, you can be free of each one. So remember, I want you to put on the glasses, the perception for this episode today as we dive in that you are the problem, but you are also the solution. Keeping that frame of reference, keeping that perception on as we dive in is going to allow you to really greet this information for what it is, see it for what it is, and take action and apply it how it's best going to serve you. So today's addiction, it's really the fifth addiction out of the 8 that I saw so much in myself and the women leaders and teams that I work with. The 5th addiction is our addiction to our patterns. Now, you have probably heard of patterns, and you could also have heard of programs. I want you to think of patterns today, both as it applies to, when I'm saying patterns, other people might say programs. So they could reference to it in the way of, this program no longer serves me, or I am reprogramming my mind. I am referring to them as patterns. And the reason I like to refer to them as patterns in this context is so that you can see the different layers to the pattern and have more of a visual. If you think of a pattern, that's more of a visual to me than if I think of programming. Programming is a little more out there as far as getting an image and being able to visualize layers to it. So first, let's talk about patterns and how we can become addicted to them. So the addiction is formed by the fact that our patterns are not in the conscious mind. Most of us experience our patterns in the subconscious, which is not revealed to us on most occasions and can easily play in the background. But the issue is that our subconscious mind leads our life. And so my intent today in highlighting these different layers is so that you can start catching yourself like a thief in the night and bring awareness to what's going on in an effort to bring it from the subconscious into the conscious and consciously change it. So patterns can be funny because patterns are not as obvious as a trigger. Patterns really make up our lives. And so it can be challenging at some point to really say, okay, which part of my life is a pattern, right? Isn't it all a pattern? And I would agree with you, right? It's like our lives are patterns if we don't consciously choose something different. Our lives are made up of patterns, right? How we interact with our spouse, our partner, how we interact with our family. It's based on a pattern. You figure out the dynamic between the two of you or between you and the family. And unless someone is consciously working to uplevel that, to grow it, to evolve it, it stays the same. I'm sure you've had this experience. I know that I have, where I haven't seen someone, particularly a family member, for many, many years. And then I go back and I'm flooded with all of the memories of the person I was the last time I was with them. This is such a great example of patterns because it's easy to go back and have those, amazing memories and sort of enjoy those memories, right, with that person. But the truth is that who you are today is much different than 5 years ago. But if you're going back and seeing that those patterns are there and the dynamic is how it used to be, that's just a great visual example of how patterns can play out. So the addiction is one that's very unconscious, but the addiction is our patterns are reality, and that's how it is. And you can see how the pattern being the reality can easily take you into being the victim, right? That's addiction number one that we went through. And so the idea here is patterns and the addiction to those patterns is really this idea that that's just the way life is. That's just the way my relationship is with that person. And as a high achiever, I know for you, you're determined to create things the way that you want them to be. But patterns can often be an area, such a large area, right? Because patterns really make up our lives, that can go unnoticed and really take you back into the addiction of being a victim, because they're so often make up our lives. And so it can be challenging to break it down and figure out which part of this experience is a pattern. And what I found is look at the whole. When I am experiencing something that I don't really enjoy or that lights me up completely, I can know on some level that a pattern is running, and it's probably an expired one. And so there is this tension, right? This conflict that happens when we become something greater and our patterns haven't come with us, right? We need to uplevel that identity, if you will. So identity and patterns can very closely coincide. And so thinking of who you are today versus who you were 5 years ago, and that family example can really help differentiate where patterns show up. But there's really a few patterns that I saw in myself, and what I found I started to get addicted to and really took over my life as far as, subconsciously driving me. And what I find is most common in the very highly successful women leaders that I work with and their companies, what's most present from the patterns perspective they're addicted to. So the very first pattern, now this is groundbreaking. If you get this, you're going to start seeing huge shifts in your life. I know when I got this, it was so profound for me to realize that I had a wrong perception that was it was affecting everything. It was affecting everything in my life. So the first pattern that I see most often is a distorted perception of self. In other words, the pattern is I don't see myself like you see me. You see me as this highly successful entrepreneur, mover and shaker, high energy, all of the things you see me as. I don't see myself that way. So there's a disassociation between the reality of who I am, who I'm being, and how I see myself. This is problematic because I can't fully receive compliments. I can't really experience the success or joy that I have created. And so what happens is it really affirms on a regular basis that I'm operating in lack, because I can't ever feel the depth of what's happening because there's this disassociation between how I view myself and how the world views me. That pattern can be very detrimental, not only because of what I just mentioned of not being able to feel and experience and really relish in the joy of what I create, but it can be detrimental because it's essentially as if you have an expired lens at all time, meaning that you're not seeing yourself progressing and moving forward and achieving and seeing yourself from that perspective. So you're actually limiting yourself, and it's a huge energy loss because your perception is, I'm not enough, I'm not enough, I'm not enough, I need to do more, it's not enough, versus really seeing things for what they are. So that's the first pattern that's most common. Are you ready to step into your power as a conscious leader? Are you seeking a community of extraordinary, like-minded women who are making a difference in their internal and external world? Well, look no further. We'd love to introduce to you Legendary Leaders Advisory, a premier women-led and women-owned leadership community that's focused on success, not just externally, but in the internal world as well. We are the first and only leadership community that contributes a portion of its membership fees to fund and inspire the next generation of leaders through both scholarship and mentorship opportunities. And the best part, it's led by its own members. If you're looking for a community with a different conversation that addresses the necessary connection between internal and external results, look no further. Click the link in the show notes to learn more about Legendary Leaders Advisory, and one of our Truth Teacher consultants will reach out to you to discuss the opportunity further. The second pattern is around self-worth. And so for highly successful leaders, it doesn't show up so much as questioning, if you're worthy, but it can show up a lot in pricing and products and how things are structured in the business. It can show up as, a pattern of questioning self-worth or doubting self-worth is how much time you spend explaining something to an employee. It can show up as how much time you spend with employees. Maybe you spend double the time that's necessary in different meetings. It can also show up in not charging enough or changing products and services so frequently that nothing can ever really take root or get started because there is this worthiness piece. And so it doesn't always show up how you think it should. And that's why these patterns can be deceptive, because they look a certain way, but when you really dig into them, it's about something else. And again, this podcast, it's all about getting to the root of these topics so that you can see and be free instead of just dealing with the symptoms, because we don't have time for you to be stalled or held up in these different, dysfunctions. The third one is people pleasing. This is so interesting as far as how common this is with women leaders that are successful at the 7, 8, 9-figure levels, of how people pleasing is still very present. There is a level of people pleasing that you just cannot maintain, right, once you get to certain levels of success. But what's really interesting is it can show up in different ways. It can show up by not really asking for what you want in some instances, being really strong maybe in sales and asking for the sale, right? Because you wouldn't get to those levels of success if you couldn't close the sale or if your team couldn't close the sale. And so you may be really strong in that area, but people pleasing shows up in different areas like, working too long or being the last one, to leave the office, or whatever the case may be. People pleasing can show up in really fascinating ways. What's fascinating about people pleasing is it's very much tied into that first addiction we talked about, being a victim, because what that really is affirming an amazing tool that I'll go into in more depth on another podcast, but it's called the Cartman Drama Triangle. And in that Cartman Drama Triangle, it was designed by a Dr. Cartman back in the 1950s, this idea of Everyone is in a triangle until they decide otherwise. And if someone is acting like a victim, there is a rescuer and there is a persecutor. And so in people pleasing, what's really interesting with successful leaders is that a lot of times there will be this desire to rescue, desire to save, whether it's a client, a team member, or frankly, even yourself. And what can happen is then you're affirming someone else as a victim, yourself included. And so I'll get into that in more detail on another podcast, but that's just a really fascinating pattern that I had in myself that I also have seen in my clients that you would not think is present in a successful entrepreneur, right? Because it's like once you see someone that's highly successful, you think they have it all figured out. You think that they don't struggle with these things. And that's part of why I want to go into these addictions, is to universalize the fact that we all struggle with different patterns. We all struggle with these addictions. And when we can start to see that we are one, I'm no different than you, then there can be this common ground which breeds compassion. And when we have compassion for ourselves and what's truly happening, that's where growth can happen. That is where we can see the root and stop the cycle. If we don't see the root, we can't stop the cycle. We are dealing with the symptoms. And frankly, the symptoms are distracting. They're like bright lights, right? It's like squirrel. You see the symptoms, you're like, I figured it out. That's the answer. That's why I do what I do. But really, it's just a distraction. And so bringing you back to this universalized statement, right, of we are all one. We are all experiencing something, a version of what I'm talking about today. And when we can have that compassion, that's when things can really change. The next pattern is boundaries or lack of boundaries. This is another one that's been so surprising, is with successful leaders, boundaries is so important, right? It's the boundaries of the schedule. It's the boundaries of meetings. It's the boundaries of delivering on deliverables to clients and to team. But what's really fascinating about boundaries or lack thereof is this idea that you have to self-sacrifice to get what you want. That you have to compromise so substantially to get to that finish line. And so this pattern is to really see that whether it's lack of boundaries in all areas, or if it's just one really focused area that you can identify, is to start bringing your attention to the addiction behind it. Because when there's lack of boundaries, there's people pleasing. And when there's people pleasing and lack of boundaries, there's issues with self-worth. And when there's issues with self-worth, there's a distorted self-perception. So do you see how I've built this tower of these patterns? It's a cascading effect. When you are having issues with boundaries, really what you're having issues with is people pleasing, valuing yourself and what you're here to do and your time. Because you have a distorted self-perception, you feel on some level, it all comes back to safety, which I love, because it's like, if we can, again, put our hands on the root, things can get really juicy and we can really transform. But the root of all of this is, why do you have a distorted self-perception? Because at some point you weren't safe. So that cascading effect had to grow and start from somewhere. The next pattern is withholding. Now, withholding is interesting because the pattern is really this idea of holding back, whether it's holding yourself back, whether it is holding your magic back, whether it is not speaking up or expressing yourself because you want to get it perfect. I know that was true for me, is I wanted to get it just right and packaged so it made sense. So at the core, right, it was so it could be perfect. But that withholding is very addictive because there is an extreme amount of perceived safety when we hold back. When we hold ourselves back or hold back an idea, hold back our expression, that is an extreme dose of dopamine that you're safe, that all is well, and it can get dysfunctional quickly. So at first it can feel safe, but over time it's extremely detrimental because you're constantly finding yourself not following through, not delivering for yourself, which leads to a slippery slope of self-deception. The last one is resistance. And so resistance can show up in ways like just resisting being open to a new idea. It can show up in ways resisting change, right? For a lot of strong-headed leaders, it can be, resisting change or resisting that new idea because you know best. And so the pattern of resistance and withholding can really be a double-edged sword, because those things that you're doing are also what's feeding into not holding boundaries, people-pleasing, questioning your worth, and having that distorted self-perception. So as I've talked about these patterns, I'm going to leave you with a few questions so that you can really dig into this and reflect more on which resonates most with you. So my first reflection question for you is, which pattern do you relate to most? Which pattern of what I referenced do you relate to most? And do you see as most dominant in your life? The second question, how can you see that the addiction to the pattern you relate to most has blocked you from becoming the next level of you? And the last question, once you've identified the pattern that most runs in your life, what are you committed to replacing it with? Now, you might not know exactly the depths of what you want to replace it with. You can reach out to me. I can help you with that. But the idea here is, once you've identified the pattern that most runs in your life, what are you committed to replacing it with? The idea here is to get you thinking of who you want to become. Because if you look at these patterns, yes, they're subconscious, but they are blocking you from your becoming. And so the idea here of what are you committed to replacing it with gets the brain looking for a different solution. So remember, you are the problem and the solution, and going into these patterns is going to help you get to the bottom of what's blocking you from your becoming. I'll see you next week.
Are you experiencing change and breakthroughs as you listen to Becoming? If so, show us some love and hit the subscribe button, leave a review, and share an episode. I love bringing this content to you each week, and together, listener by listener, we can wake up the world. See you next week.